Good afternoon, everyone. Buenas tardes and welcome back. I know that many of you have had a very fulfilling day filled with lots of information and hopefully lots of new connections. I started out by saying good afternoon, but I also just want to say good morning and a special shout out to our friends from Guam who are joining us and have been with us these last couple of days. Before we get into our plenary this afternoon, I have a couple of announcements and a few reminders. All of the conference materials will continue to be available for up to 6 months on the conference website, which I think many of you are already super familiar with. Also want to encourage folks, if you are interested, to continue to engage, or if you're new to it, to participate in the communities of practice, as well as using the early childhood connector to continue to engage with new folks that you've met throughout these last couple of days. In addition to that, we will also be starting up 2 new learning series coming this spring and summer. The first will be building parent leadership from a systems perspective. This will be a multi-part learning series and is designed to identify how programs, communities, and state systems leaders can collaborate to build readiness to support authentic parent leadership. The second learning series will be titled Maternal Health Equity. This multi-part learning series will be designed to identify how home visitors play a key role in supporting maternal health equity. In addition to that, I would love for all of you, or you'll be getting information on save the date for 2023 summit announcements for this summer. And with that, I really would love to remind you all to please complete the end of session survey immediately after this plenary session. You will get an email with a link to complete that survey. And if you would please do us the favor of completing that, because that will help us determine whether we are virtual or in person next year. So please take a moment to do that. I also want to make sure that folks know that if you complete the survey and submit it, we will be having a raffle where 3 participants will win your choice of prizes, including a gift card from bookshop.org, which we heard about when we all gathered together on Tuesday, or a 1-year membership gift card to Headspace. So pretty good stuff there. And so with that now, it's my pleasure really to transition us into our plenary session for this afternoon, titled Listen to and Trust Black Mothers, Eviction Research for Action. During this plenary, we'll hear about methods and preliminary data from the Social Epidemiology to Combat Unjust Residential Eviction Study, or SECURE, a community-based, participatory, and mixed methods research project focused on court-ordered and illegal residential evictions and their impact on Black women in Metro Detroit, Michigan. This project is for Black women, by Black women, and is focused on collecting evidence for action in service of our shared liberation. So with that, let me introduce very quickly our 2 panelists who will be joining us this afternoon. The first is my pleasure to introduce to you Karen Howard, who is a founding partner of Crossover Partners, LLC. Karen has decades of experience in early childhood policy, and with more than 20 years of experience in the legal, policy, and advocacy arenas. Karen has also served as the director of policy for Nurse Family Partnership. Karen currently sits on the board of directors for Nurse Family Partnership and Bright Beginnings, and is a member of the Summit Steering Committee. And Karen will be joining us after the main presentation to engage in a deeper conversation. But now it's my pleasure to introduce to all of you, Dr. Shanita Seeley Jefferson. I know you're going to be blown away this afternoon, so just whatever you're doing, stay connected. So Dr. Seeley Jefferson is a social epidemiologist, whose primary research seeks action to combat manifestations of structural racism, that limit the human rights of Black families and communities. Dr. Celie Jefferson is the founder, director, and principal investigator of the Social Epidemiology to Eliminate Disparities Lab, or SEED. The mission of the SEED Lab is to conduct high-quality research to find solutions to the disproportionate burden of infant mortality among Black women. Specifically, Dr. Celie Jefferson's scholar activism draws from the reproductive justice framework and seeks to document associations between systems of oppression and preterm birth, explicate the intervening biological, social, and psychosocial mechanisms, as well as identify effect modifiers of these associations among Black women. The goal of her scholarship is to inform future intervention studies, policy change, and social activism. And so with that, I turn it over to you, Dr. Celie Jefferson.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And it's a pleasure to be with you all today. I want to start by acknowledging that I am occupying the traditional homelands that were stolen from the Meskwaki or Red Earth people. This statement is one small part of disrupting and dismantling colonial structures, as well as pervasive revisionist histories. I also understand that gender identity is not binary, and my reference to women throughout this talk is in keeping with the original self-identification of the study participants in the data set that I use. So first things first, my identities absolutely inform my work. I'm a Black woman, a partner, and a mother, a highly sensitive INFJ. I'm a very proud Detroiter and a first-generation college graduate. I don't get to choose between scholarship and activism. I have to do both. I am in the academy, and my primary allegiance is to the liberation of my community. I also trust myself and my ancestral memories and ways of knowing. So the plan then is to discuss theories and frameworks that I use to understand the problem that my work seeks solutions for, specifically preterm birth and racial inequities in this adverse birth outcome. I'll talk about neighborhoods and health, and then we'll talk about my secure study, which is Social Epidemiology to Combat Unjust Residential Evictions, and then we'll have plenty of time for a discussion. So I want to start by talking about reproductive justice, which is defined as the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, to have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. And I highlight safe and sustainable communities because a lot of my work is focused on neighborhoods and how they matter for Black women's health. Reproductive justice as a frame was coined in Chicago in 1994 by the Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice, and it combines reproductive rights and social justice. And it's based on the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was a comprehensive body of law that detailed the rights of individuals and the responsibilities of government to protect those rights. Reproductive justice is not about choice, but about access. We understand that the choices that people make are a function of the choices that they have. And it's focused on all reproductive rights, not just abortion. So that includes contraception, comprehensive sex education, sexually transmitted infection prevention and care, alternative birth options, adequate wages, prenatal and pregnancy care, domestic violence assistance, adequate wages to support our families, safe homes, and more. And a reproductive justice analysis draws attention to the ways in which the history of white supremacy operates in a capitalistic system to affect the present reproductive lives of individuals and communities. So intersectionality is also relevant to this conversation because it illustrates how racial and gender oppression interact in the lives of Black women and people, and how gender is structured through race and class, and how Black women are targeted for multiple simultaneous oppression. And intersectional analysis considers the interconnections not only as they influence individual identity and experience, but also as the systems themselves are entangled, co-constructed, and mutually dependent. And the driving purpose behind an intersectional framework has always been how to examine how to shift systems of power, not just how to better understand or describe these systems. And only when we imagine the intersection of race and gender can we imagine the needs and perspectives of Black women and people rather than focusing on what's immediate and proximal and easy to measure. An intersectional frame helps us to understand how a holistic intersectional approach will enable us to ask the right questions as well as find the right solutions. So now let's talk about fundamental cause theory, which was articulated by Lincoln Phelan to describe why is it that we see an association between socioeconomic status and mortality over time, and this relationship has persisted despite radical changes in the diseases and the risk factors that have been presumed to explain this relationship. So in the past, this relationship between SES and mortality has operated largely through infectious diseases. We would have expected that once we intervened and did away with a lot of the causes of infectious diseases, that this relationship between SES and mortality would have been reduced and wouldn't have persisted for as long as it has. But that's not what happened. This relationship has endured despite us intervening on the main cause of the main pathway through which this exposure impacts this outcome. This fundamental cause theory helps us to understand the cause of the causes and who is at risk of the risks. So fundamental causes have 4 essential features. The first is that they influence multiple disease outcomes. They affect these outcomes through multiple risk factors. They involve access to resources that can be used to avoid risks or minimize the consequences of disease. And they are reproduced over time through the replacement of intervening mechanisms. An important implication of this theory is that health inequalities resulting from a fundamental cause cannot be eradicated by addressing intervening mechanisms, because there are enduring inequalities in knowledge, money, power, prestige, and beneficial social connections that ensure that these mechanisms are reliably replaced. So the long-term impact of the fundamental cause on the health outcomes or the health inequities can only be eliminated by reducing inequalities in flexible resources. So now let's talk about systems of oppression, which are all of the isms. So racism, sexism, heteronormativity, classism, ableism, et cetera. These are systemic and directional power relationships among social groups in which one group benefits at the expense of other groups. And these systems are multiple and interlocking, and their interaction is complex rather than simply additive. So whereas the systems of oppression model that I just talked about identifies the scale at which oppression operates, so among individuals who are embedded in institutions, the 5 faces of oppression model describes for us qualitatively how systems of oppression operate. So there's 5 faces. The first is exploitation, which refers to the systematic transfer of resources from one group to another. And then we have marginalization, which is the prevention or limitation of full participation in society through exclusion from, for instance, the job market, healthcare systems, public benefits programs, or community activities. Powerlessness is the deprivation of the ability to make decisions about one's living or working conditions. And then cultural imperialism is the valuing and enforcement of the dominant group's culture, norms, and characteristics. And then violence, including physical, sexual, and emotional violence, as well as the threat of violence and policies and structures that condone violence. So it's important to note that some of these manifestations of oppression could be understood in terms of more than one of these faces, and there's no hierarchy of oppression. These systems manifest in some ways that are similar, in some ways that are different from each other. So what we see here in this table is that across various social determinants and adverse health outcomes, people who are members of the global majority compared to white people are made vulnerable and experience disadvantage in multiple ways. So it doesn't matter what exposure or health outcome we look at, people who are from the global majority tend to do worse. If we look at wealth or poverty or incarceration rates, infant mortality rates, we see the same thing with communities of color and those who are made vulnerable by multiple oppressions. They do worse, no matter what outcome we're focused on. So the way that we sort of explain these inequities by race in terms of health and social position has evolved. We started off with this racialized expression of biology idea, and this has been disproven. This is based on the idea that average biologic differences between members of diverse racial and ethnic groups are assumed to reflect some innate genetically determined differences, which is not true. Our understanding has sort of shifted from that to this idea of biological expressions of racism. And this reflects lived experiences of racism and how people literally embody and then biologically express experiences of economic and social inequality from before they're born to the day they die. And this biologic expression of racism produces social inequalities in health across a wide spectrum of outcomes. So we understand then that it's racism, not race, because race is a social rather than biologic construct. It refers to social groups that share cultural heritage and ancestry. Race is justified by ideology. One group benefits from dominating other groups, and their identity is tied, the identity of the dominant group is tied to this position of domination. And race is based on selective and arbitrary physical characteristics. And actually, this conversation is not a new conversation. W.E.B. Du Bois was talking about this in the 1800s. So there have been large and enduring associations with health and mortality that have been evident for as long as we've had data. And then racism is institutional and individual practices that create and reinforce oppressive systems of race relations. So Dr. Kamara Phyllis Jones articulated these three levels of racism. So we have institutionalized racism, which is different access to goods and services and opportunities in society by race. Personally mediated racism is prejudice and discrimination. And internalized racism is where the stigmatized group accept negative messages about their own abilities and intrinsic worth. So we can understand structural racism with this picture of this iceberg. The tip of the iceberg represents acts of racism that can be seen like cross burnings or someone calling me the N-word. But the proportion of the iceberg that lies below the water represents structural racism. It's more dangerous and it's harder to eliminate. And then policies and interventions that change the iceberg's tip will not work because structural racism is the macro level systems, social forces, institutions, ideologies, and processes that interact with one another to generate and reinforce inequities among racial and ethnic groups. And structural mechanisms do not need the actions or the intentions of people to be effective. Even if interpersonal discrimination was completely eliminated, racial inequities would persist. So then systemic racism has been shown to be a fundamental cause of inequities by race. And this is born of the economic advantage that slavery had for white people when this nation was founded. It's in all of our major institutions, and it's pervasive in the stereotypes, the ideas, the emotions, and practices of our society. And socioeconomic conditions that undergird systemic racism are reliably reproduced over time. And it embodies a set of flexible resources that advantage white people, including structural factors like domination of major government and commercial institutions, including elected and appointed government offices in national, state, and local levels, the educational institutions, the penal and legal systems, mass media, on and on. Also, individual resources like money, knowledge, power, and prestige, beneficial social connections, which are held disproportionately by white people, and then social and psychological advantages, such as expectations that white people should dominate, beliefs that white people are superior, and desires for social distance from Black and other people of color. And the broad range and flexibility of the resources that racism provides white people facilitates the reproduction of socioeconomic status inequalities by race. So there's multiple examples of how systemic racism impacts racial differences in health outcomes. But this figure from Lincoln Phelan shows us that systemic racism through multiple replaceable mechanisms impacts both racial differences in flexible resources and racial differences in socioeconomic status. And you'll note that these two circles are overlapping, but they aren't entirely overlapping, which suggests that there are some aspects of socioeconomic status that are not covered by flexible resources. And then both of these things impact racial differences in health outcomes through another set of replaceable mechanisms. So there's been a lot of literature on the impact of racism in health and then linking racism to health requires pathways. So there's a lot of literature, and I'll refer you to Dr. Zinzi Bailey's work, which this table comes from. It just shows you all of the pathways through which racism has operated to impact poor health. So we have economic injustice and social deprivation, psychosocial trauma, political exclusion, as well as maladaptive coping behaviors and other things. So much scholarship has established these pathways. There's still more to know about the impact of structural racism on health, but this is absolutely a good foundation. So now let's talk about preterm birth, which is the outcome that I focus a lot of my work on. It's defined as birth before 37 completed weeks of gestation. It's a multifactorial syndrome. We don't know the entire etiology of preterm birth, but we know that it's the second leading cause of infant death overall, and that's a good metric that we use to gauge overall population health. The outcome of your birth is also related to your adult chronic disease risk. And then we know that there are stark and persistent and disgusting inequities in infant mortality, whereas it's the second leading cause of infant death overall. It's the leading cause of death for Black infants. Compared to other industrialized nations, the United States ranks poorly in infant mortality. And this figure is showing you infant deaths per 1,000 live births over time from 1915 to 2017. So I want to direct your attention to the most stunning piece of this figure, which is that in 1916, Black mothers were 87% more likely than white mothers to bury their babies before their first birthday. And in 2017, Black mothers were 122% more likely to bury their babies before their first birthday than white women. 1916, 87%, 2017, 122% more likely. This data tells me something very specific, that every single thing that has been done, all of the public health initiatives, all of the research dollars, all of the investment hasn't worked at the population level, because these inequities in infant death have gotten worse over time, which is stunning. We just declared racism a public health crisis in 2020. I would argue that the reason that we've seen 100 years of data where inequities in infant mortality, in this case, but we can look at a whole host of outcomes, we aren't dealing with the fundamental cause. So these inequities are going to get worse unless we intervene on the root cause, not on what's proximal, not on what's easy to measure, not on what makes us feel good. So I also want to raise up into our consciousness the 400-year history of African Americans here. So in order to understand and make sense of the stark and persistent and disgusting inequities in infant mortality in this case, but in racial disparities in health in general, I argue that historical context is key. Here I'm showing a timeline of the history of Black people in this country, with 1619 marking the first record of African chattel slavery. From 1619 to 1964 was 345 years of inequitable treatment, poor health status, and absent or inferior medical care for African Americans. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was less than 60 years ago now, and it was supposed to end segregation in public places and ban employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And we have evidence that this legislation did not do what it was created to do. So from 1964 Civil Rights Act till now, this only represents 14% of the history of Black people in this country. And this historical context and unequal starting points have health impacts across generations. And the history of Black people in this country is unlike that of any other racial or ethnic group. And this history matters for the current population levels of adverse health that we see. So I'm going to now talk about neighborhood context, which I study neighborhoods because we can do something about neighborhoods. They group together beneficial or non-beneficial resource circumstances for people, like healthy food and good medical care and recreational opportunities. Neighborhoods were identified as an important determinant of health in 1979 in the Surgeon General report. And then Williams and Collins reported evidence in 2001 that suggested that racial segregation is in fact the fundamental cause of differences in health by race, specifically because African Americans live in starkly different neighborhoods than whites. These neighborhoods are often more disadvantaged in multiple ways. They are a legacy of historic redlining, intentional government policy to harm Black communities. And the relationship between neighborhood context and poor health and mortality is not a function of individual level resources. So these relationships have been shown even after you adjust for individual level resources, these relationships persist. So the way that we measure neighborhood effects, usually investigators link address data to data from the US Census or American Community Survey. We call this type of neighborhood measure objective neighborhood measures. We can get sociodemographic characteristics, either single items, or we can create indices of disadvantage at the neighborhood level. There are some advantages to using objective neighborhood measures. They might capture important structural aspects of neighborhoods that residents cannot or do not perceive. So for instance, neighborhood disadvantage might shape access to local resources that ultimately affect health, even if people generally have a positive appraisal of their residential environment. Across the literature, though, we have some variability in the use of objective variables across studies. So this limits our ability to say whether and how neighborhoods matter for health. Another limitation is that neighborhood socio-demographic characteristics is the only thing we can get from the US Census, and that may not equal the true neighborhood construct that we're interested in. As an alternative, we might directly query study participants about their perceptions of the neighborhood that they live in. We can have trained observers go out and assess things like the quality of the housing stock or whether there's graffiti on the walls or those types of things. We refer to this type of neighborhood measure as subjective. So this is a summary of the processes through which neighborhood physical and social environments could contribute to health and health inequalities. And I adapted this figure from Ana Diaz-Rue and colleagues. And this is basically showing us the complex relationships between neighborhoods and health. So we see residential segregation and socioeconomic status, which is dynamically related to inequalities in resource distribution. These things impact both the physical and social characteristics of a residential environment, which then impacts behavioral factors, which is dynamically related to stress. Personal characteristics and like material and psychosocial resources and biological attributes are also a part of this relationship, and all of these things work together to impact health. So now I want to talk about residential evictions. So we know that residential evictions are the most harmful source of instability. Most people pay, many people pay more than 50% of their income in rent and utilities. And we know that 1 in 4 renting families pays more than 70% of their income in rent and utilities. And only 25% of families who qualify for affordable housing assistance actually get it. Eviction is the most understudied issue that affects urban minoritized residents, and it results in financial hardship, insecurity, powerlessness, depression, and even suicide. So we know that court-ordered evictions happen a lot. 2.3 million low-income renters per year are impacted by eviction. This is an important determinant of health. Black women who are parents and who are victims of domestic and interpersonal violence are more likely to be evicted than other groups. And we know that eviction is to Black women what mass incarceration is to Black men. Both of these things are a cause, and both of them are a consequence of poverty. We don't know anything really about illegal evictions, which are evictions that do not go through the courts. We know that illegal strong arm lockouts and unofficial orders for the tenant to vacate a rental property happen 40 to 50% of the time. We don't have any data on the magnitude and severity of illegal evictions. So in this paper, we were interested in neighborhood evictions and their relationship with preterm birth, and whether or not marital or cohabiting status was related to preterm, was a modifier of this relationship in Black women. So what we found is that the eviction filing and judgment rates were not strongly correlated with other neighborhood variables that we examined. that the range of evictions in the neighborhoods that our study participants lived in ranged from 0 to 78 per 100 renter occupied homes, and eviction filings range from 0 to 132 per 100 renter occupied homes, which means some of the homes in the neighborhoods that our study participants lived in had evictions filed against them more than once in a 12-month period. We also found that neighborhood eviction filings and judgments were not associated with preterm birth in the overall sample. So when we look at everybody together, but the results were different depending on marital or cohabiting status. Specifically, women who were married to or living with the father of their baby and living in neighborhoods with high eviction filing rates and high eviction judgment rates, they had significantly higher preterm birth rates. These findings document the burden and severity of the housing crisis, point to the urgency of action toward eliminating manifestations of structural anti-Black racism, and highlight the interconnectedness and multi-level impact of systems of oppression on the health of Black people. So this leads me to the SECURE study, which is Social Epidemiology to Combat Unjust Residential Evictions. I want to raise up in our consciousness this quote by Zora Neale Hurston in 1937. If you are silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it. This study is focused on court-ordered and illegal evictions. I have a community advisory board of Black women leaders from various sectors. It's a $1 million grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that allows us to collect evidence for action for the first time, the magnitude and severity of court-ordered and illegal evictions in this area and their impact on Black women, their families, and our communities. So we're focusing on, so we're using some data from a prior study, and we're linking those residential histories to data from the eviction lab. So we'll be able to ask the question, does living in a neighborhood with eviction rates over time, high eviction rates over time, impact Black women's birth and maternal outcomes? We're also doing focus groups. So we're assessing what is it like living in a neighborhood where you see other people being evicted across 3 counties in the Metro Detroit area. And then the illegal evictions piece of SECURE study is we're fielding a survey among 1,600 Black women to get at what proportion of them have this violent experience of an eviction, especially the illegal evictions. And then we'll be doing in-depth interviews with Black women who themselves have experienced this source of housing instability. So this is just showing, we have a community advisory board, we have our website, we have a research team. This study is for Black women by Black women. This community advisory board is helping me in they are co-creating and co-leading the work. They are involved from start to finish. They help me name the study. They help me to design the instruments, to do the recruitment. We are committed to our liberation, and they have been invaluable in the conduct of this research project. So I wanted to just give you a little preliminary data. We absolutely haven't analyzed this data yet, but from our focus groups, it's clear that living in a neighborhood where you see your neighbors evicted is traumatic. There are negative mental health impacts, there's community destabilization, and there's stigma and shame. And one of our study participants said, I had an eviction and the court gave me a little bit of time to move. But the next day, the landlord sent some goons to my house threatening us, and we just left. So this is not in people's understanding about what's happened. So this woman in her family had a court-ordered eviction, unfortunately. And then the next day, the landlord came and illegally evicted her. The landlord did not honor the court's ruling, and she just left. So there's no record of this ever happening. If she didn't share it with us, we wouldn't know that this is happening. So this is coming out in our data, and we've just started. I want to end with Professor John H. Bracey is a historian. So I'm an epidemiologist, but my thinking isn't bound by my discipline. I read across disciplines. Racism is not free for anybody. Professor Bracey offers a provocative analysis of the devastating economic, political, and social effects of racism on white Americans. His work is a departure from the analysis of racism that have focused primarily on white power and privilege, and he focuses on the high price that white people, especially those who are in the working class, have paid for more than 2 centuries of divisive race-based policies and attitudes. His central point is that failing to acknowledge the centrality of race and racism to the American project not only minimizes the suffering of Black people, but also blinds us to how white people have been harmed as well. Professor Bracy says that the clientele for the payoff for white supremacy is getting smaller and smaller.
Oh.
All of us, in one way or another, pay the price for what has and is happening to Black people. And the failure of this nation to deal with this in the past and in the present has consequences for all of us. Racism distorts reality. This mythology that tries to make racism something that happens somewhere else robs you of understanding your relationship to that history and its present manifestations. It disarms you, and it disarms your ability to function in the world with the antagonism that you see before you. His analysis is in hope that at some point there will be a more joint action to correct this situation, indeed, because our shared liberation is at stake. So I want to just offer a few reflections. This question about who and what is responsible for racial inequities in population health is something that we need to be clear. It's definitely not the people who experience poor health and early death, and it's definitely not their biology. Home visiting is not apolitical, and it should not be ahistorical. We need radical truth telling, and we need action, because the status quo is absolutely not working. We definitely need a revolution. So what causes the unequal production and distribution of the conditions that promote and harm health is the question. And to answer it, we need critical self-reflection as well as inner work. And we need an intention to align our values, principles, and unique lived experience and identities into the work that we do for action. So I want to acknowledge the life study participants who shared their data with us for the sake of finding solutions to the problems that impact Black women and our families, my Seed Lab and co-authors, the Secure Study team, and our funders. And thank you so much, all of you, for being here. I look forward to our conversation.
Dr. Sealy Jefferson, thank you so much for such a powerful presentation and a clear call to action, a clear spotlight on our national crisis, which is racism, our nation's history of oppression against Black and Indigenous people, and so clearly making the case that as a home visiting field, housing and all of these systems is our lane, right? And so a lot of comments in the chat were affirming what you have said, how home visitors and administrators and researchers have seen it in action in neighborhoods. And so I want to let you know that because you weren't able to see the chat. I want to lift up, you quoted Matthew Desmond, who wrote Evicted, to say eviction is to Black women what mass incarceration is to Black men. Black men get locked up, Black women get locked out. But it's clear, right, that from your presentation that eviction is a small tip of the iceberg. There is a history of slavery, racialized terror, redlining, segregation, economic, environmental oppression. So talk a little bit about just in terms of housing, the quality of housing, neighborhoods that are starkly different and under-resourced. Before we even get to evictions, if you could talk a little bit about, from your research, the impact of that on health and education and well-being.
Thank you so much. So this is a really good question. So this is helping us to sort of understand what we're dealing with. The way our society is organized unfairly privileges white people and unfairly disadvantages people who are not white. Both of those things are happening and both of them are unfair. And the structuring of our society sets it up so that Black people have shorter, sicker lives than people who are not Black. Like this is not accidental. Every single inequity that we see by race is a function of the way our society is organized around racism. The racism is the foundation, like that's baked into every single sector of our society, and it impacts everything. So if you don't understand history, you will see inequities in cancer and inequities in infectious disease and inequities in COVID. And you'll think, oh, what are those people doing that's different than people who aren't doing so poorly? That's the wrong question. The right question is, how is it that this society is set up that is causing people to have poorer health outcomes by racial group? We know it's not biology, and it's also not a function of people's poor choices and decisions. So if you don't understand history and you don't understand, if you don't tell yourself the truth, if you don't tell yourself the truth about what's happening, what you see and why you see it, there's really no way to understand the magnitude of racism and how it has operated in this country for us, for Black people, for 400 years. We are only 14, right now, it's 14% of the history of Black people here. Great. 14%. So we have 345 years of all of those oppressions, by like legal oppressions. It makes perfect sense that we would have higher rates of everything, that we would die earlier from nearly everything, that we would have lower intergenerational wealth, that we would.
It goes on and on. Yes.
History,
yes.
History helps us understand. Right. And also imagine what the possible solutions are. And that infant mortality data that I showed you over time tells us that if we don't do something about the root cause, we're not going to be making any kind of population impact and eliminating these inequities by race. And that's a problem.
Absolutely. Thank you. Turning to the questions that we have in the Q&A, your research found illegal evictions were correlated, right, with greater instances of preterm births among Black women who cohabitate with their spouse or their partners. Help us because that runs counter to what we would think. So help us understand why that is.
Yeah, so let me clarify. That is neighborhood level eviction rates. So Black women who are married to or living with the father of their baby and living in neighborhoods with high court-ordered eviction filings and judgments had higher preterm birth rate. And one of the things that when I saw this finding, I was like, this is the opposite of what I would have expected, because all of this literature is suggesting that being in a two-family household is causing people to have higher social support, higher income, more stability. And I grappled with this with my research team, and I was like, if we can't make sense of this, it's not going to see the light of day, because
that's right.
One thing we're not going to do is put forward literature to suggest that if you are partnered with a Black man, and living in a neighborhood with high eviction, your chances of having a preterm birth are higher. So that's blaming that's not the frame that we wanted to take. But one thing that we've been, so in the paper, we talk about why we think this is. If you are low income and you're partnered with a man, living with or married to someone, the chances of you getting social services are reduced. You're not eligible. A lot of these programs are focused on single people, so like single women. I also think that this mass incarceration eviction quote that from Matthew Desmond helps us also to understand, if you are partnered with a Black man, the chances of him not having any contact with the criminal justice system is low. So by the 30s, it's such a common experience for Black men in this country. And I didn't get to talk about the mass incarceration as a very powerful manifestation of structural racism. But if you have any felony record or anything, like, you also don't qualify for affordable housing. So we think that living in a neighborhood with poor quality housing stock, with a lot of other people being evicted, is stressful to relationships. So it's the contextual effect of stress. So like seeing people evicted, you would assume this could happen to me too. It's destabilizing for the neighborhood, but also this is stressful for families.
Right.
So our study participants in Secure Study are helping us with this. They're like, no, that makes perfect sense. It's
Right.
stressful. It's stressful when you live in a neighborhood. If you are in a neighborhood that is experiencing eviction and you are in a relationship with someone who maybe can't work because of their record, who can't, there's a lot of things at play. It's complicated. That's one thing that I'll say.
Well, we look forward to, as your study progresses, we really look forward to hearing the lived experience and understanding that and matching that with the data. One question that we have, public health rhetoric often includes terms like empowering an individual or community, especially with communities of color, and particularly Black communities have always had power through resistance and demonstration. What are your thoughts on using this term to describe positive outcomes of programs in individuals and or racial groups? Do you have a suggestion or what terms would you use instead?
This is a good question. I would say there's no right or wrong terms that will be applicable to communities across the board. I have been known to say, sometimes it endears me to some people and sometimes it doesn't, that if you are not a member of the community that your research is in service of, you should not be trying to lead. Your job is to find people from that community, let them use their voices, empower them, give them opportunities, give them resources, let them do the work that is tied to their own liberation. And then you let them tell you what the framing should be. So I don't think that there's one lexicon that should be used across communities, but I do think a lot of public health research has been rooted in colonialism, and I think that's also part of the problem.
Right. So giving communities, allowing them self-determination and agency and being a good ally to them, no matter what term you use, right? But recognizing the strength of the community and the resilience and how we have always fought against oppression. We have a question that you've talked about the high rate of Black infant mortality, and you did a phenomenal job of comparing in 1916 what the rate was and 2015 and showing that it's gotten worse. The question is, I did not hear your thoughts on Black mothers and the racism that feeds into the Black maternal mortality rate.
Yeah, so I focused on infant mortality as this is an example of what happens when we don't address the main thing. And it's funny, I just had a paper accepted for publication today that's focused on injustices in Black maternal health. So focusing on Black maternal morbidity and Black maternal mortality, which those numbers are stunning. Disgusting, stunning, not in a good way, because these inequities by race in maternal
in fact,
mortality,
I think it's the greatest disparity, right? It's the greatest disparity in all of health when we're talking about that. Yeah.
Because the majority of these maternal deaths are preventable. Should have never happened, but they are happening because Black women are the group that experiences racism and sexism. No other group experiences both of those. And that is literally killing us.
Now that we know that this is home visiting's lane, right? After all, home is in our name, right? Is in the name of the program. Now that we know this, we're starting to be educated on just the impact and legacy in our own American history. What are some of the things that you would suggest that home visitors, administrators, researchers, home visiting models, writ large home visiting, what are some of the things that we can do?
I think this is a good question. I think, so this answer is not limited to home visitors, but this is absolutely applicable to home visiting as field researchers, everybody. Most of us do not get the benefit of having an anti-racist education.
Right.
So we have people who were on the planet during legal segregation.
Right.
And they don't understand why there are so many inequities. You have to do the reading. You have to do your work. You have to do your inner work. You have to reflect on your experiences and reflect on your position in this society. And then you have to tell yourself the truth about what this is and what your relationship to it is, the problem. And then I think it's important to not say, oh my goodness, that's such a huge problem. I wish somebody would do something about that. Because my response to that is, aren't you somebody?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We're all somebody, right? So it's not somebody else's job. It's not somebody else's responsibility. If you just decide, pick a problem and decide to dedicate yourself to doing something about it. I mean, we're having the same conversations that W.E.B. Du Bois was having in the 1800s.
That's right. That's right.
At some point, it's our responsibility. We have to decide that we're going to do the right thing. If you have unearned privilege, divest some of it. Use it for the benefit of people who have less or no privilege.
Yeah. And
or
so
you're part of the problem.
Dr. Seeley Jefferson, I couldn't agree more. Can you talk to a lot of folks in the field think that they are doing something about this by virtue of doing home visiting, by virtue of helping one mom, one family at a time beat these odds? Talk to me about what is wrong with that or what's right with it.
So I'm gonna point back to that data on infant mortality for the last 100 years. It has helped individual people. So all of the things that have been done has helped individual people, but look at the data at the population level. That does not work. Mm-hmm. It's not sustainable and it doesn't work. And you actually, if you don't center the work, center your orientation on equity, your work could literally create inequities. Even with you helping one mother at a time.
Right.
Because the mother that you're helping might be in a position to take your help. And it's worsening the gap between the people who can and cannot even access your help. So it absolutely, I use this, that figure, infant mortality rates over time as a very powerful example. That data says nothing has worked at the population level, right? Because 1916 was a very specific point in our history. So if the rates are better in 1916 than they are in 2017, what in the world? But who knows that? Nobody talks about this, right? Like people don't usually say that these individual level interventions don't work.
Right.
The theory tells us that they won't work. The data also corroborates that they do not work. They actually exacerbate inequities when we don't do the heavy work of eliminating the fundamental cause, which in this case, what will happen in 100 years, the projections are clear. In 100 years, this is going to be worse than it is right now. Can you imagine?
That is right. That is a compelling reason enough to go upstream and start to get at the root causes. We do have time for one more question, and it is, are you going to study the rate of infant mortality for Black women who do not live in poor communities or Black women with higher social economic status? The rates are higher for them than they are for poor, white, uneducated women.
Right. That's right. So my study is open to Black women. The criteria, secure study is open to Black women who are 18 to 45 years old, who live in one of the 3 counties and who are parents or have parents enrolled. I have people who have enrolled in my study who are faculty at research institutions, top 5 schools of public health in the country. I have people across the socioeconomic status spectrum. And the prior study that I showed you data on also has that. So we have wide variability in terms of who is eligible to participate, who actually participates. And we are comparing Black women to Black women. That's also novel with our work is the group is a comparison group to Black women. We compare Black women to Black women. White women are not our standard. There's no, the 2 groups are incommensurate. So actually it's methodologically problematic unless you're trying to document disparities, which we have enough documentation of these disparities. So we are comparing Black women to see who in this high risk group has the highest risk. What protective factors are there so then we can scale those up? what do we need to intervene on so then we can do that intervention. And hopefully in the next generation, we see some improvements. Black babies should live, not die.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This has been so powerful. Thank you so much. I want to give you the opportunity, because this is really a call to action to the home visiting field. I want to give you the opportunity to leave with one thing you want to tell the audience that they can and should be doing, or one thing you want to leave them with as we go. And I want to let folks know, if you want to continue this discussion like I do, please get on Twitter, #HomeVisitingSummit, where we will hopefully continue the conversation. But what would you leave the group with?
I would leave this group with a strong recommendation to do your inner work, because that'll help you to show up more fully in the world, doing the work that you were created to do. You need to figure out what you were created to do, and you need to do that. And if you think you found out what you were created to do and it doesn't involve service, that's absolutely not your purpose.
Amen. Dr. Seeley Jefferson, thank you so much. I want to turn this over to Yvette.
Woo! So I also want to express my sincere gratitude, Dr. Seeley Jefferson, for your authentic, genuine voice. I think we are leaving today. I'm copying people here on the chat, blown away. And I just want to, again, I want to thank you so mil gracias. Like, I don't even know how to just say thank you, but, and Ms. Karen, thank you for bringing Dr. Seeley Jefferson to us. This is really exciting. And I want to let folks know that you can continue this discussion both on Twitter, but also that the discussion tables are going to be open right after this session. So you can continue the conversation amongst yourselves and to do your own inner work and keep moving this forward. I also want to remind folks, please, to complete the end of the session survey so that you can tell us what you want to see as we start to plan for next year. Maybe we continue this conversation with Dr. Seeley Jefferson as we go into the next year, because I'm sure there will be more work to talk about, and we can all figure out what we've done in that time to hold each other accountable to move forward. Before I close this out, again, just want to give my thanks to both of you, Dr. Seeley Jefferson and Ms. Karen, for this afternoon, for sending us out with a call to action, and for, I think, moving so many people. I think there's so many folks who are still a little bit speechless, but I want to make sure that everybody seriously takes this time to process and figure out what you're going to do, right? And so with that, I just want to really close us out to say that these last 3 days have really been amazing. It has been an opportunity for all of us to come together as listeners, as learners, and as leaders. And I also just want to challenge everyone, because as we've heard over and over these last couple of days, and just even this afternoon, none of this comes easy. None of this comes easy. Equity just doesn't simply happen without intentionality. Breaking the cycles and understanding what the root cause is doesn't just happen. We all have to do the work. And I just want to push you all, as you go back with all of your colleagues into your daily life, into your work, is to really take back something to those folks who couldn't be here with us today, and to create space to think about how to do things differently, to stop doing the things that we know are not working, and also to think about how do you create space and seed power, if you have that power, to others about how this work is impacting them, so that we can all figure out how to do this differently. And ultimately, I want to thank all my colleagues at Start Early, everyone on the steering committee, all of the individuals who have made this possible, and especially all of you for sharing your time with us, because I think we've all learned that time is the thing that you can't get back. So thank you for being here with us. I wish you all well. And in the words of Cesar Chavez, a civil rights leader, ultimately said, always remember que sí se puede. So thank you all very much for being with us, and be well.